Hello and welcome. So today we're going to be looking at labour markets, and we're going to start off the world of labour markets by looking at labour demand. Now, labour is something that you are familiar with, you've had a look at before, and that's mainly in macro, where you've had a look at kind of the economic cycle and labour as a factor of production. So labour is a factor of production, it's one of the 4 factors of production. It's a super important, well, I mean all the factors of production are equally important, but it's a really interesting area of the factors of production. That's my personal opinion. I love labour markets. So labour, first and foremost, when we look at it under kind of a micro or a macro gaze, and that can be really confusing for you guys, especially when it comes to paper 3, where you have to kind of talk about micro and macro combined in your 25 mark essays. And no essay, keep them separate, but labour markets really is one of those areas where you can kind of use it for your micro side and your macro side. I would say to think about it kind of as an overriding rule of when you're talking about labour markets for macroeconomics, it's kind of more about unemployment, and when we look at labour markets for microeconomics, it's more about employment itself, right? So labour markets being a derived demand, you have to employ labour to make goods and services that are sold, right? So if I want to make a certain good or service, I have to employ some labour. That might just be myself as an individual, but that still is one unit of human capital, right? I as a unit of labour is a unit of human capital. So it is a derived demand. The demand for labour will follow the demand for goods and services. Kind of a rule, we'll have a look at that in a little bit of time. So you, from that assertion and from your macroeconomic knowledge, should be able to understand that labour markets is going to follow the economic cycle. And in some ways, labour market-wise, micro-wise, that is true. And in some ways, it's not true necessarily. Not all labour markets follow the economic cycle, but we can have kind of a common rule that talks about how unemployment follows the economic cycle. So here I've just put Olkin's law. Olkin was an economist that talked about unemployment and growth, and basically he said that if your GDP growth rate is higher than your labour productivity, unemployment will fall, right? So if your demand is growing faster than your labour productivity is growing, then unemployment will fall. And so we can say that unemployment follows the economic cycle to some regards, depending on your labour productivity, etc., etc. But can we say that employment follows the economic cycle in all economic markets? Absolutely not, and we're going to have a look at that a little bit later on in today's lesson. So one of the things that I see students getting really confused about when we look at labour markets is about who is demand and who is supply. In all of the other markets that we have learned about up until now, we have always known that the demand comes from consumers and the supply comes from producers. And that's absolutely the same rule in the labour market. It just takes a little bit of tweaking in your brain to think about where that comes from. So if we think about, say for instance, me, I'm a unit of human capital, I am a teacher. Who is the producer of that and who is the consumer of that? Well, think about it like this. I produce the human labour and my school consumes that human labour. So actually when we're thinking about the demand curve and labour markets, producers, so to speak, are individual workers, individuals who are entering the market to provide their services of labour, and the consumers of that labour are actually firms and businesses. They are the ones who are consuming labour. So when we look at labour market, because it's a factor of production, consumers such as yourselves, individuals, me going to go shopping, buying goods and services, actually aren't so much in the direct labour market relationship, but they influence the labour market relationship through that derived demand. So what do we think the demand curve for labour is going to look like, and what do we think the graph is going to look like? Have a little think about that before we move on to it. You might want to pause and have a go yourselves. Here we go. So obviously we have quantity, and we know that labour is derived demand, so we're just going to be tracking the demand of labour to do with 2 things: the quantity supplied and the price. But labour's a very specific market. We know that the price of labour has a very common term. What is it? It is the wage, right? So we know that we are going to be looking at the wage versus the quantity. So when wages are very high, what is the quantity demanded going to look like? When wages are very low, what is the quantity demanded going to look like? So we know that it's going to be downward sloping because when wages are very high, then obviously you can't employ that many units of capital, of human capital. And when wages are very low, we know that you can employ a lot of human capital. So it's going to be a downward sloping curve that looks like this. So this is our demand curve. And we have to think about, when we look at our demand curve, actually what are we demanding and what effect does that demand have on the firm? Because remember, the firm is the one that is demanding those goods and services. And actually what affects the shape of the demand curve? Well, for that all you have to do is think way back to before, about when we're looking at all other goods and services and their demand curve. What affects their demand curve? Well, substitutes, right? And that's exactly the same as the labour market, apart from the fact that the labour market has a very, very specific substitute, and that is, for human capital, the substitute is obviously physical capital. So when you are a firm and you're thinking about your output, right? And remember that we always make the assumption in economics that your output is equal to your income, because we assume that normal market forces will clear the market, and therefore whatever you produce will get sold. So therefore, because of that assumption, your output is always going to be equal to your income. So therefore we don't separate the two. So often you will see Y written down as output and also income, because we assume that they are the same thing. So when you think about a firm and their output is going to be produced by a combination of their human capital and their physical capital. So if you think about it like a very basic mathematical function, the output Y is going to be equal to some kind of function of their capital and their human capital. So if you think about kind of like their output is going to be equal to some form of function of their capital and their human capital. Which means that actually there is going to be some form of kind of transferability between those two things. So if the price of wages is really, really high, what is a firm going to do? Well, if you think about it in terms of any other demand curve, any other supply curve, it's all to do with opportunity cost. The higher the labour cost, the higher the opportunity cost of not employing more capital. So when your labour cost is really high, it actually becomes cheaper, inverted commas, for you to invest in more capital and less labour, right? And the same as when labour costs, the wage, is very low. Well, if your labour cost is low, your opportunity cost of not employing physical capital is also going to be really low, right? So it's going to cost you less to employ human capital over physical capital. So this relationship here is going to be very much affected by this relationship here. And the higher the cost of human capital, the more kind of worthwhile it becomes investing into physical capital, because you know that there's going to be some kind of relationship between those two things. Now that relationship is going to change depending on your industry or your firm, and we'll have a little look at that right now. So we know that there's going to be an elasticity of demand for labour, the same as there is an elasticity of demand of anything else in kind of goods or services. And really those rules of elasticity for all the other demands, they apply here too. So it's not only that we're learning loads of new stuff, it's kind of more that we're adapting the learning that we already know. So here we know that if a demand curve for labour is very inelastic, or even a little bit inelastic, we know that that means that as wages rise, then demand for that labour is going to be a less than proportionate change. So if we have a 10% change in our wage, if our wage goes up by 10%, then the amount of labour that we're going to demand, potentially the amount of labour that we're going to switch to physical capital, is going to be a less than proportionate change to that 10%, right? And then that means that our labour demand is going to be inelastic. And what is that going to look like? Have a go, have a pause, draw it, tell me what that's going to look like. It's going to look the same as any other inelastic demand curve. It's just going to be downward sloping with a very, very steep gradient. And our elastic demand curve as well. If it's elastic, then when wages rise, then demand for labour is going to have a more than proportionate change. So if we have a 10% increase in our labour cost, our labour wage, then we're going to see that the firm is going to switch to capital or just make do with the labour that they currently have and hope that they invest in labour productivity to a more than proportional change. And what is that going to look like? Have a pause, think about it, draw that data down. This should give you a hint as to what it looks like as well. Well, it's just going to be exactly the same as all the other ones and have a really, really kind of smooth gradient, the same as all of our demand curves that are elastic before. So what I really want you to do is I want you to pause the video, I want you to have a go at thinking about what markets, what labour markets specifically are super elastic or super inelastic or have like a relatively normal kind of elasticity where it's just kind of proportional, unilaterally elastic. I want you to think about labour markets. I have a hint for you if you're struggling, just think about what we've learned about before, or what can we transfer for capital to human capital to physical capital, and also think about the idea that labour is a derived demand for the goods and services that labour is going to produce. Right, so have a think about those two things and that will really help you come up with ideas of labour markets that are inelastic compared to labour markets that are elastic. Have a pause, have a go. So I have some examples here for you, like you might have come up with some really cool examples. Mine are super boring and I apologise for that. But hopefully I have some that you have here. So I put some inelastic ones. So basically what we're saying there is if the wage of, if labour for some reason demands higher wages, and we'll go into why that may or may not happen, what is going to happen to the labour market is demand going to change. So if we have an increase, this kind of stark increase in the wage, what is going to happen to demand for that good or service? So I put here that we could have doctors, teachers, I put plumbers as well. Like, don't think that that kind of idea of like skilled or unskilled workers have an immediate effect on the idea of them being elastic or inelastic. It might have some effect, like the idea of if you have a skilled worker versus an unskilled worker, the likelihood is that the unskilled worker is going to have a more of elastic demand, but that doesn't always fall through because we have a lot of other things that affect the labour market that we'll have a look at later on in time. Also, just a quick note on unskilled and skilled labour. I know there's been a lot of debates, even in Parliament, about the term skilled and unskilled. When we use the term skilled and unskilled here, we are literally looking at replacement rate. So we're just looking at if you are a skilled worker, if I decided to leave teaching, how easy would it be for the market to replace me? The harder it is, because the more skills that you need to be able to replace that worker, then the more skilled that worker is. And the same the other way around with unskilled worker, it's just pretty much about replacement rates. So if we look at unskilled workers, how easy it is for the market to be able to replace that worker. And it has a lot to do with elasticity, but we'll have a look at that in the kind of upcoming lessons. So that's what I'm talking about, we're talking about skilled and unskilled. So don't necessarily think that unskilled workers are always elastic and skilled workers are always elastic. And also, of course, I put here doctors, we know that they're very inelastic. Partly of that is to do with the idea of the derived demand. We know that the market for healthcare is particularly inelastic, but we also know that it's very difficult to replace a doctor with technology or kind of physical capital as it stands. So therefore we know both of those things mean that it's going to be a very inelastic demand. Teachers as well, kind of like maybe just like a shout out to my own job there a little bit, but we are relatively inelastic when it comes to demand, mainly because education itself is very inelastic and also we're very difficult to replace with physical capital. And I put plumber here as well, just as an example of like an unskilled labour that's also like pretty inelastic. There are a few things that I really want you to understand. One is this can definitely change over time. If you looked at maybe like some inelastic kind of jobs, maybe 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they might be completely different to the ones that are on here now or on your own list now. I put here some examples, so like typesetting in the past, which is where kind of before technology advanced to kind of print newspapers and to print things. Typesetting was a really highly skilled job that was very much in demand, and then actually over time, because of technological advances and the way that we kind of read things and we engage with that market completely changed. That meant that the derived demand, the way that we demand the good and service changed. It became a lot more elastic, and also technology replaced them. The cost of technology versus the wage of an employer started to change, an employee started to change, and therefore it became a lot more elastic, and actually the job became eradicated, no longer exists really, apart from like in very small kind of niche specific markets. Might be something you might be interested in. And equally, pilots as well. Pilots are completely changing, maybe like 5, even 10 years ago, the idea of a pilot being completely inelastic would absolutely be making it on this list. I think like in 10, 15 years, are they going to make this list? Probably not. And it's probably because if you think about that relationship, is the way that we are engaging with flying changing? Probably not. Like our derived demand is still going to be relatively inelastic. I mean, I don't know, with the pandemic and things, it might change things, but our demand is going to be relatively inelastic. However, this is to do with technology. Technology is overtaking and changing, and therefore the way that pilots work and their job, even though they are an incredibly skilled worker, is changing, and maybe they might not be on this list in a few years or decades time. Equally, I have some elastic examples for you: bar staff, retail workers, salespeople. All of those jobs are very elastic. So what I mean by that, if the wage goes up, then they can switch around. Like people will enter the market or they'll leave the market when the wages change, and equally demand will change as well. So for instance, if the bar staff or if the wages of retail workers go up, we've seen that here definitely in the UK and in lots of other kind of economies too, that as the price of wages have gone up and as capital, physical capital, has become cheaper, then a lot of these jobs have become automised. That's definitely not the right word, but they've definitely changed to physical capital, and also they've kind of a firm will make do, inverted commas. So rather than if the national minimum wage, or if just through normal market mechanisms the wage increases in like a retail job, rather than employing lots of other people, they might just make the labour that they currently have work longer shifts, or kind of be more productive in their normal shifts to cover that change, right? So actually it is going to be very elastic demand. And the same with kind of like salespeople as well. If they become cheaper, then a firm might employ more. If they become more expensive, then they might employ more. Now, we're going to have a look at labour supply a little bit later on, like in the probably next week or in a few weeks' time. And then we'll start to have a look at like transferable skills. Like, I think that people get really sensitive over the labour market, and like absolutely rightfully so, but actually the idea of something being elastic, very transferable skills. Somebody who's a bar staff, works as bar staff, actually has a lot more transferable skills than maybe someone who's super skilled worker, and we'll have a look at that in a few weeks' time. And one of the other things that I wanted to kind of look at or maybe mention very, very quickly is about unions. So unions can have a huge effect on the labour market. They can enter the labour market and or kind of be created within the labour market and have a huge effect on what is happening in the labour market, right? So they can have a huge effect on labour demand, but they can also have a huge effect on the labour supply, and they are one of the things that kind of can affect the elasticity of labour demand, or they can shift or change labour demand. And we're going to have a look at unions specifically and other things that change the labour market a little bit later on, but kind of just be aware going into this that unions are one of the things that you might want to kind of get ahead, have a research on or research about. So this is our kind of first lesson on labour markets. I hope that you enjoyed it, and we will have a look at shifts in the labour market demand next lesson. Have a great day. Bye guys.